We will start our talk about individual differences on about intelligence. I'm sure you're familiar with IQ tests. We don't use them as often as they did in the past to judge intelligence, but using them to look at correlations and correlation studies is very common. IQ tests in correlational studies with second language acquisition are more strongly related to metalinguistic knowledge than they are communicative ability. And it seems on those tests that intelligence seems to be related to the development of a second language in areas like reading, grammar, and vocabulary, but there is no relation in oral production or the ability to speak well or speak better than someone else. So the conclusions here, I guess, as we talk about intelligence, is that students may be weak in general academic performance, and they can still show evidence of success in a second language acquisition if they are in the right communicative environment and given the right opportunities from a teacher. And so IQ does not necessarily, well, and there is no correlational study to show that it directly relates or doesn't relate to language acquisition. The next thing that we'll talk about is language learning aptitude. An aptitude is the ability to learn something quickly. The hypothesis in this test was that learners with high aptitude would have the ability to learn with greater ease and learn something quickly or more quickly. But in the various tests, it showed that various aptitudes in different areas among the students, such as the ability to analyze, memorize, or categorize, there's a lot of different aptitudes that one could have, when they were paired with the right teaching that matched their aptitude, they were not only more satisfied, but were more successful. So one might think about how many different aptitudes a kid would have, and just giving them the right circumstances, the right activities, the right situation could help them be successful. There wasn't one aptitude that was more successful than another. So the challenge in this is that for a teacher is to find instructional approaches that meet the needs of all learners with all of their different aptitudes. And teachers may accomplish this. In no way could they do that all the time. But just by varying the activities and the strategies that you use throughout your lessons, what you're doing for one student is good for all students. And so a variety of those things really helps all students succeed. Studies have also found that all learners benefit from deductive instruction, which means explicit rule-based grammar instruction followed by opportunities to practice. So one of the huge studies that was done with aptitude looked at 3 different kinds of studies, and I think this was a study in New Zealand. But it talked about deductive instruction. So they had 3 different groups, and the deductive group, just like it says here, received explicit rule-based grammar instruction followed by opportunities to practice the rules that they had just learned, and in context and lots of oral practice. And then another group, they were called the inductive group, received no grammar instruction, and instead they participated in activities that just encouraged them to figure out meanings that were conveyed by object pronouns and then to be able to turn around and produce them, but they received no instruction. And the third group was this structured input group, and they received explicit rule-based grammar instruction, but they were not allowed to produce the target forms. Instead, they participated in activities that just exposed them to spoken and written examples of those forms. So of those 3, the studies, and this was quite a large study of over 2,500 students, I believe, showed that all of those learners, no matter what their aptitude was, were benefited from the deductive instruction, which, looking at that, it's a very balanced instruction. We've got to have the explicit followed by opportunities to practice and then opportunities to talk. So nothing new there, but just reinforcing what good teaching is. This can be interpreted that more structured teaching with opportunities to practice may even out a teacher that's trying to focus on all the individual differences compared to someone with just less structure in their teaching. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about learning styles. A few years ago, learning styles were huge, and I remember as a teacher giving a test to my students to find out what types of learners they were. And an individual's natural, habitual, and preferred way of absorbing, processing, and retaining information is their learning style. So we sometimes will even say this, that I'm an auditory learner, a visual learner, a kinesthetic learner. And this was widely reported a few years ago to have a strong correlation with lots of different types of learning, and especially second language learning. But looking across the board, there is very little research in this area, and many believe that these styles develop or change over time. They're not something you're born with. You can exposure to a certain learning style or a way to learn, and then experience in that learning style could change how you learn or how you desire to learn. And Hattie did some research on this, and it really has 0.3 is the effect size, which is still positive, but we like to look at 0.4 and above as those that are really worth our time and our effort. So interesting, something that I did as a teacher, I know, and spent a lot of time on, but there's just not a lot of correlation, especially for our ELO learners. So we can't encourage this necessarily as a practice of strong correlation, but it doesn't hurt to help learners use any means available to them if drawing pictures or having the kinesthetic piece. These are just a variety of activities that help learners make those connections and learn, but we shouldn't put too much emphasis on them. All right, let's talk a little bit about personalities. It's interesting, that's part of the job as a teacher, is to look at individual personalities and try to support and teach to those. But they definitely play a factor in second language acquisition. There are some correlations that extroverted individuals who are more assertive and adventurous definitely have more success in second language acquisition, but there's also studies and correlations that in certain situations, the quiet, observant learner has just as much success. So not enough to really, put strong focus or correlation on that. There is also substantial evidence to support the fact that inhibition is negative. So if you're inhibited by things, that it's hard to learn a second language. Learner anxiety can also be negative and interfere with the learner's ability to process. But in some cases, it can also produce, when you're anxious about something that's coming up, it can make you motivated to go forward or to focus a little more. So positives and negatives both on that. And we talked about the affective filter a few weeks ago, and that can definitely inhibit a second language learner when they don't want to talk because they're not sure how to say it or they feel stupid. And that inhibits their ability to learn if they continually choose not to talk because they can't practice those skills. And a learner's willingness to communicate and communicative confidence also plays a role as part of their personality, but all of those are determined by the environment and the circumstances. For example, someone might be more willing to communicate if the topic is something they feel comfortable with. They might be less willing to communicate if there's a ton of people present or people they don't feel comfortable around, or if it's more formal. And so any given time, situation, circumstance might change their willingness to communicate. Other personality traits such as self-esteem, empathy, dominance, talkativeness, responsiveness have all been studied, but there is really no clear relationship between one personality trait and another as it comes to the development of second language acquisition. But many researchers do believe that personality does have an important influence on the success of second language learning. But the relationship is so intricate that it may not be personality alone, but the way it combines with other factors that actually have an influence on second language learning. So we can't discount it, and it is an important piece of the puzzle, but there's so many factors that play into it that we just can't say that that's the only thing that's important. So the next thing we'll talk about is attitude and motivation. Again, it is not easy to determine whether positive attitudes produce successful learning or successful learning engenders positive attitude, or whether both are affected by other factors. But there is simple evidence that positive attitudes are associated with a willingness to keep learning. So that's the key piece here. So in here, in the book, it talked a little bit about learners have communication needs and attitudes. So if a learner needs to speak a second language and they have to do it in a variety of social situations, or they have to fulfill a professional ambition, sometimes they perceive the communicative value of the second language and are more likely to be motivated to become proficient. But also if learners have favorable attitudes toward the speaker of the language, maybe it's a family member or a close friend, they also might desire more contact with that person, and that's motivation as well. So the instrumental motivation is that they're learning for immediate or practical goals. And what we call interactive motivation is they're learning for personal growth or for cultural enrichment, friends or family, something like that. So those are two really big factors in attitude and motivation. There's also 3 phases that go along with attitude and motivation. The first one is called choice motivation, and it refers to getting started and set a goal. So oftentimes we're good at this, especially in exercise, right? We're super motivated at the beginning to get started. We set a goal to lose weight, or we set a goal to learn the language. And then the next phase is the executive motivation. And this is the actual doing what we set out to do, the carrying out the tasks. And then it's our choice here to maintain motivation based on success. So we begin our exercise regimen, and if we feel successful, we start to see that we lose weight or whatever, then we feel more successful and we would continue in that process. With a language, it might be the same thing. We continue to learn, we feel success, we continue. But on the other end, at this point, if we don't feel successful, we may quit, and then the cycle stops. But then sometimes, like in the next stage, which we call motivational retrospection, then we appraise our reaction and our performance, and we make decisions based on that. So we might come across someone else that thinks that they had success on it, and so we decide to start over again and continue learning or continue on our regimen and our diet. And so, but we kind of think through that and make those decisions. So there's lots of reasons and cycles of motivation that affect our learning. Motivation in the classroom is another key factor, and teachers have the biggest influence and contribution in this. They can make a positive contribution to student motivation to learn if their classrooms are places that students enjoy coming to, if the content is interesting and relevant to their age and ability, if the learning goals are transparent, challenging, and manageable and clear to them, and if the atmosphere is supportive. So teachers have a huge factor on motivation in the classroom and motivation to learn and the ability to learn. Studies found that there was a positive correlation between teacher motivational practices, the learner engagement of behaviors, and the learner's self-reported positive feelings about learning. And so teachers continue to play a critical role in that, in our students. Another big feature here is identity and ethnic group affiliation. So social factors in a wide community can affect motivation, attitude, and second language learning. Children, as well as adults, are sensitive to social dynamics and power relationships, and that affects their learning. So classrooms can be places where children are looked upon as more or less able, and judgments are made, and that can be a social environment that affects learning. And certain cultures are also more willing or less willing to communicate. For example, Japanese students are more reluctant to speak English in communication lessons, despite high levels of motivation, because they don't want to appear superior. And so they prefer to just focus on meaning and form rather than communication. And we see that in a lot of different ethnic groups and how they feel and what they believe. So let's move forward. Learner beliefs are also important. Many older learners have strong beliefs and opinions about how they learn and how language should be delivered, and that might interfere with their learning. Another study found that while most students expressed their desire to have their errors corrected, few teachers felt that was the best way to teach, and so that created a disconnect. And many second language learners value grammar instruction, although not all cultures agree it has value. And then they also don't agree on how and when that process should be taught, and that affects learning as well. And then the final thing here is age, and age is easier to define and measure and study than personality, motivation, or aptitude. And so there's lots of different studies, and there are many factors that play into second language acquisition and age. There are many adults that actually achieve high levels of acquisition, and many young learners that never achieve a sophisticated understanding. And so research points to the fact that second language acquisition is most likely to succeed if it begins early and in the very young, but it isn't always that way. For learners who acquire a second language primarily in the natural environment, age of acquisition is an important factor in setting limits on the development of native-like mastery of second language, and that this limitation does not only apply to pronunciation. So in conclusion, it remains difficult to predict how a particular individual's characteristics will influence their success. Nonetheless, in a classroom, the goal of the sensitive teacher is to create a learning environment with a wide variety of instructional strategies and activities so that the learner with different attitudes, abilities, and learning preferences can be successful in learning that language.